I think a healthy dynamic is where there is room for a bit of that pushback, obviously in a respectful, relational way, but there has to be room for checks and balances.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Reclamation Podcast, a beEmboldened initiative. If you are new to us, I am Naomi. I'm the founder and executive director here at BE, and we exist for those impacted by religious trauma by providing support for prevention of victimization and revictimization. We desire to offer a safe space to ask questions and to heal. You can learn more about the resources and support services we offer by visiting beEmboldened.com. This episode is sponsored by Yobel. They are an adult clothing and accessories company focused on the ethical treatment of every individual in the fashion industry. They desire to steward the planet and its resources in a sustainable way and ensure that profit is mutual, not at the expense of someone else down the line. You can support their ethical and sustainable small business by also support B at the same time by going to shopyobel.com. You just enter live free in the notes at checkout, and then beEmboldened will receive a percentage of your order. Emily and Clay are the owners there at Yobel, and they are incredible. We adore them, and they have a community that they are creating that is just focused on impact, and we want to support them. So thank you for being a part of supporting them and supporting us at the same time. For today's conversation, I've invited one of beEmboldened's mentors, Joshua Stringer, to share his own personal story of religious harm. And he has graciously agreed. So he's here with us. Josh is a Master of Social Work student with an experiential focus in religious abuse. He is also the joint owner of a grant writing business specializing in social justice and mental health issues. Josh, to get us started, how would you describe the religious group you were involved with?
Well, I would say that primarily it was a deeply unhealthy church. And before I get too much into that, I want to thank you, Belle, for sponsoring this. Fun fact: people in sweatshops get paid as little as 8 cents a shirt for
Mhm.
like NFL jerseys, that sort of stuff. So ethical clothing is a big deal. Anyway,
Yeah,
if you need
agreed.
to edit that out, go ahead.
Yeah, oh
Anyway,
my gosh, yeah, I watched the documentaries and I learned more and I've talked with them and I'm like, this really matters. So even when being Bolden, we've released shirts periodically, things like that. It's like we get them from the same suppliers that Yobel uses. They told us who they use, and we're like, no, we're not over here trying to help people in one area of abuse while supporting another area of abuse. And granted, inevitably, we probably are unknowingly somewhere, but as soon as we know about it, we want to change it. So I
mhm.
agree. Thanks for giving a nod to them.
And I find that in the realm of abuse, there's those inconsistencies that really are at the heart of it. You know, you can claim God's love and God's forgiveness in one area, but not for this certain, group of people, or not for this certain sin. And that's not what the Bible says. So when I hear other people's stories and thinking about my own experience, when people cherry pick, what it is that they want to believe or what they want to accept from the Bible, it very much goes into that ethical quandary of, do we have consistency across the board? Are we treating one group of people very differently, have a completely different set of standards on their lives because of our own messed up priorities?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Great segue. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. And so again, we may have things we don't know about or things we find out about, we're not sure what to do with them. But again, once we know, it's like, okay, what steps can I take? What changes can I make here?
Yeah, and you have a choice.
Yeah, and exactly. You're right. Same in religious abuse. Once we see doctrinal issues, once we see it's like, oh my goodness, I can't just unsee this,
Mhm.
but the impact is huge. And so now what?
Yeah. And to go back to that unhealthy church that I was a part of, it was very difficult to discern that it was unhealthy, because when I first started going there, had just moved to a new state and was in a very vulnerable position in my life, and so some of it was rock solid, and then the other stuff kind of slowly crept in and got more insidious as time went on. And that that really, even to this day, looking back, it scares me how hard it was to see just when that transition, occurred from this was a decent church that did some good things to this is a deeply unhealthy church that's actually hurting people.
Mhm. Yeah. How would you describe yourself at the time of becoming involved with this situation? And I mean that like relationally, emotionally, spiritually, whichever direction you want to take it and you want to share.
Yeah, so when I was growing up, um, I like to joke that I'm a recovering Baptist because we were part of this church that had really sound doctrine, um, but was really short on love and grace. So
Mhm.
it ended up becoming very legalistic. And if you didn't obey God, if you didn't obey your parents, and kind of to the letter of the law, then your salvation was at stake, or at least you know you would be guaranteed to lose a lot in the fire that you have to pass through to get to heaven.
Okay.
So it's very I was in a very vulnerable position, and then being isolated, not being around my family, and even though my relationship at the time was very strained, um, I was in this place where I wanted connection. I wanted to feel like I belonged, and I wanted acceptance. And I hadn't. There had been a period of time, about 10 years, where I hadn't gone to church at all. So I had a
Mhm.
solid foundation in the Bible until I was about 11 years old and such. And then there was about a 10-year gap where I wasn't involved in any sort of church. And then I started going to church and realizing the need for that community.
Mhm.
But I found myself going from, childhood into adulthood and not knowing how to go about having that healthy community. So I was in an unhealthy church in my previous state, and then moved here and found that I just kind of fell into the same thing without even realizing it, because it was literally the first church that I attended. First Sunday I was here, and I stayed there for several years, and then that church just kept getting worse and worse.
Okay. So you became connected with the church just by sort of happenstance. It's where you walked in.
Yes. I prayed that God would, put me in the church where He needed me to be. And, you know, a few years ago, I would have been like, why on earth did I end up at that church if I
Mhm.
prayed for God to put me in the place where He needed me to be?
Mhm.
And now being where I am, realizing going through spiritual abuse to that extent, and then coming out of it and having that redemption and then being able to help others.
Mhm.
Obviously, that's God puts you through things in order to have a greater purpose. It's not necessarily about you, um, even though it is always. You're part of the story, and you're chosen and loved by God. And so it's huge that interplay between that the suffering and then the redemption and the healing that ends up occurring.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't know if now's a good moment to really delve into the theology of it, but so I'll just say this because there's room to disagree with different things, essentials and then kind of non-essentials. And so I think I would phrase it differently on my end. I think I would say more that from from the conversations I've had in the setting I've done, I would say that God will maybe allow
Hmm.
allow us to go through things and allow things to happen, versus, of course, stopping. It's kind of a do we have free will conversation. So again, that's why I'm like, I don't know if we should like really, because it sort of starts to spiral and it
You
becomes a
go in the
really
deep end
big,
there.
yeah, it starts to become a really big conversation. So I don't want to do that because I think it would derail too much from your story that you're sharing. But I just want to make a note there for listeners where maybe they're like, oh, so did God put me through my spiritual abuse? I would put a pin there and say, let's talk about it more because there might be more to that conversation. And there's room for us to land in some slightly different places and for that to be okay.
Yeah,
And we can move forward and still have unity and have good relationships with one another.
absolutely.
So I just want to mention that. Um, and as far as you winding up as well in this second situation, that was not what you were looking for, not what you would have hoped for. And it sounds like was not really the truth of who Christ is in the Bible. And again, we'll get into that more. I think it really highlights the revictimization that we talk about at Be Emboldened in general, that people come out of one problematic group, church community, whatever word we want to use for it, and then until we kind of get our feet under us, we're really at a higher risk for re-victimization. And it sounds like your story speaks to that is what happened. And my story is similar. I had some of that too. And I'm like, oh my goodness, finally I'm through in the I'm like, I've got to figure this out. Like I need to learn more. I need to have my feet under me so that I'm gonna recognize because I don't want to do this a third time.
Yeah, that's hit the nail on the head there.
Hmm. So, what were the main tenets of the culture in this environment you found yourself in? Maybe the ministry's leadership.
Yeah, so the I say that it was an unhealthy church, and then by the end of it, it had pretty much devolved into a cult, because they had gone from teaching the Bible to twisting the Bible, and one of the big things that they were teaching was the exclusivity of that church, and how, basically if you weren't part of that church, then you weren't actually a Christian, and then in every other church in the area, or across the nation, weren't the true church of God. They weren't part of God's assembly, and it was going to be their loss. And I remember when that's teaching started, I felt deeply unsettled because I knew that that wasn't right. But at the same time, it was spun in such a way where, you know, um, my own past hurt and trauma played into it. Oh, this sounds good, sounds nice, and there are biblical references to back it up, like uh, Jesus calling his disciples, and they immediately left whatever they were doing, including family members
Mm.
and long-term jobs and such, to follow Jesus. But the corresponding message was that if you are not following Jesus through this church in this way, then you're not actually part of God's assembly. And that, because of the strain in my family at the time, both drew me and repelled me to that theology, because I knew for a fact, Jesus above all else. But when you follow Jesus, you do not have to denounce your family.
Mhm.
And that was one of the things that they were teaching, is that, if your family at all disagrees with anything that this church says, then they are not of the kingdom of God. And you need to actually verbally tell them that you are no longer part of their family. And that was not something I was willing to do, even though I wasn't really talking to my family at the time.
Mhm. Oh, that's so painful. Yeah. And there are so many different churches and not actually churches, although they may call themselves churches, who practice that. I mean, I myself have experienced that.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's very official, and very direct, like you just shared. And sometimes it's not. It's sort of people just know I'm not really supposed to be engaging. It's not supported. But maybe we're not directly told. And yeah, so you were pretty directly told this is what you're supposed to do.
Right. And that was near the end of my involvement in that church. And what kind of broke this hold, if you will, was
Mhm.
one of the pastors actually, um, he had exposed what was going on within the leadership team with the
Okay.
lead pastor and all the things that were going on, and there's financial misappropriation of tithes and all that stuff.
Mhm.
There was a lot of um, counseling. I don't want to use the word counseling, but that's what they called it, where they would tell people that they needed to get a divorce because X, Y, and Z, when there was no actual basis for it except it fed into their power play. Um,
Mhm.
and this pastor had written a fairly lengthy um, document denouncing what was going on behind closed doors. And he was the pastor that I had identified with most closely. He was the worship pastor, and I was on the worship team. And so I had spent the most time with them. And I could see within him that he had changed over the past couple of years, that he wasn't as fun loving as he used to be. He wasn't as, you know, smiling and such. He'd become rather dark and morose, and yet he wouldn't talk about anything until he left abruptly and kind of just opened up this closet, and a whole bunch of stuff fell out of that closet. That's there's enormous fallout. And yet, when that happened, I still went to that church for months afterwards until the lead pastor and one of the associate pastors basically ran off together and started a new church in a different state, and just big old fallout. Um, so it was a rather abrupt transition,
Mhm.
and I was left not knowing what to do.
Mhm.
Because I could tell certain things theologically were way off, and
Mhm.
yet I wanted to hold on to the relationships that I had formed. I wanted to continue to be a part of this and to serve God in a way that felt like He had called me to. And so for like 8 months, I was the only bassist for that church, and so I was on like every single week. And I realized looking back that I was just desperate for connection.
Mhm.
I allowed myself to be hurt further because I didn't leave an unhealthy situation when it became very, very obvious that it was unhealthy. And
Mhm.
we could talk, we could spend an entire hour talking about that trauma response and
Mhm.
why
Sure.
people don't leave.
Mhm.
So I won't go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I appreciate you touching on it though. There are so many reasons why people don't leave. And yes, what is going on internally with someone, physiologically, that certainly comes into play when we talk about things like a trauma response or that threat reflex that we have that can kick in, and the desire for connection, those losses that are going to take place. I think something else that comes up sometimes is a confusion. I'm curious. I'm bringing this up, Josh, because I'm wondering if this came into play at all for you. So please let me know. There's can be this confusion of, well, there is suffering in the world and in the Christian life, and we're called to persevere, and maybe that applies here. Like, I'm going to stick it out and I'm going to see this through, and there's going to be redemption in this church body, and there's going to be, we're just going through something really rough, and it can be really difficult for people to kind of tease that out and see, when does this apply, when does it not, when do I actually call it, is there a time to call it? And that in and of itself can get really confusing.
Yeah. And I think that that's an important thing to touch on. And at the risk of revealing something too personal, that's how I knew that my former marriage was it needed to end, because instead of having conflict, even somewhat unhealthy conflict, she had started like threatening me with knives and smashing my car,
Mhm.
and was I was fearing for my life at that point.
Mhm. Right.
And so I knew I have to leave or I may not be here anymore.
Mhm.
Versus like with my wife now, and we're about ready to celebrate 5 years, I think.
Mhm.
Have two kids together. It's beautiful. We will have conflict, and sometimes it's not pleasant, but
Mhm.
there's always that sense of safety that this person, I don't have to worry that if I say something that they don't like, that next thing I'm going to find is my tires have been slashed, or that
Right.
something else scary is happening. And to connect that back to what you were saying with, when do you need to leave, when do you need to stick this out, the only thing I could say is that it's different for everybody. Everyone has their own threshold, their own limits. But at the point where it crosses that line of safety, that's when you should really consider that the warning. It's like, this is no longer a safe situation, and I should consider what needs to be done to either address it directly and try to pursue some sort of healing or redemption through it, or need to leave because it's spiraling and it could
Yeah.
become even more unsafe. And teaching is like that. When it's something that is, like we mentioned earlier, just a slight difference in interpretation, which could come as something as use a different version of the Bible than I use,
Mhm.
compared to fundamental truths and the basic tenets of what we have as a bedrock of our faith.
Mhm.
When it's um, just a little bit of a difference versus a chasm, I think that's the thing to start examining, whether it's stick it out or not.
Yeah, I want to highlight a couple things that you just said there, because I think they're important and they're helpful. So when you were talking about, now, it's not that someone shouldn't leave before it's like, okay, this is flat out unsafe. But yes, that's
True.
like, okay, don't cross that line though. And I think you were speaking to that of, that's that's got to be a stop point, guys. Like,
Mhm.
press pause and reevaluate. Now, again, doesn't mean that you shouldn't have left here, or it wouldn't have been okay for you to have left here. Let me phrase it that way. But please, by the time it's here, reconsider and make a change. And when we're talking about that kind of safety, I think, and you just spoke to this, there's different kinds of safety. So we're not just talking about, you gave that excellent example, horrific example, excellent example of your point though, of what happened with your ex-wife, of this is real physical safety. Like, we're not joking around here. It's not someone who's just, angry. Um, and I don't like that. It's, no, this this is bad. The anger is being handled in a very emotionally immature way that is genuinely potentially going to be harmful. So, and was already harmful. So, needing to say, okay, that's the line for sure. I've got to stop and reassess. When we're talking about safety, though, it's not only that physical safety. It can be that theological safety. There can be emotional safety. If you're in an environment where it's very manipulative, there's a lot of gaslighting going on, things like that. It's like, I don't even know what's happening here. I'm feeling crazy. I'm feeling like I don't understand. I'm being blamed for stuff, but I swear he said that and I heard him right. That's not a safe environment in a different way. Theologically, if we've got doctrine that's being stuffed down our throat, sometimes it feels like, and we're like, gosh, this is not matching scripture. Okay, now we've got, it's spiritually unsafe. We've got something that is theologically going to be incorrect. So, different ways to think about safety here.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you called that out.
Yes, yeah, I saw you speaking to it in different ways, so I wanna kinda bring it together for everyone. Those were excellent points. Josh, while you were an active participant, so while you were attending this church, what was your view of God in relation to the expectations upon your life, in relation to the dynamic of what you saw going on? How did you see God interacting with that? How did it impact how you saw him?
So I mentioned earlier that I kind of grew up in a legalistic frame. That was where I started, and this kind of enhanced that. It was the same basic idea that if you don't follow God's rules, then obviously you don't deserve to be called a child of God. Of course, this is same time when we were singing songs like "No Longer Slaves," and proclaiming, "I'm no longer a slave to sin. I am a child of God." Um, so it shows how there's often a dichotomy where they'll say one thing and they'll say another thing, but that double think exists, and we see that all the time in the society. But that's another conversation for another day. My view of God was very much a judgmental, intolerant taskmaster. You had to do the right things all the time with the right motives, or you would be punished. And anytime that something happened to me that was just part of life, or you know, just my own uh, distraction, because of all the other stuff going on, I would think that this is obviously deserved because I've strayed. So, God's just punishing me. And you see that all the time with different cults and people who've been in spiritually abusive situations. Is if they go through a challenging, difficult situation that may not have anything to do with something that they've done, it's all too easy to assume responsibility for that, and you know think that God's just trying to edify you somehow. Um, and that's where I was. Is I thought that all the pain I was going through, the behavior of my ex-wife, that was just God's way of punishing me, or trying to bring me back into line for things that I had done.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, you're right. That is unfortunately, tragically common in these situations. There's these commonalities. There could be differences, of course, as well, but there are certain things that seem to continue to pop up over and over again. And yeah, that's one of them. Internally, what was that dynamic like between you and other congregants, if that's the word you would use, other members of that church?
And that's the interesting thing, is that even though this was a fairly small church, a few hundred people, um, there was a surprising amount of disconnect. So there was a very small group, mostly the worship team and such, where I felt like I could relate to them, that we were friends or whatnot. But by and large, I still felt isolated within that community. And afterwards, after the um, the fallout and the one pastor leaving, and I ended up leaving the church, and my ex stayed with that church. I found that the people that I had connected with and thought were my closest friends, they ended up taking her side because she stayed in the church
Mm,
and said
okay.
things that, you know,
Mhm.
I wasn't there to defend myself, and I wouldn't have really had the strength to do so anyway. But the notable thing that I'm trying to call out is that even though we were supposed to be this isolated cell of, Christ, if you will. I still felt rather alone, and I didn't feel that connection to people around me, even though we did life together to an extent.
Mm.
And I think that that's one of the hallmarks of spiritual abuse or abuse in general, is that it makes you feel alone, like you don't have someone to turn to.
Mhm. Yeah, it can be incredibly isolating. And there's some stories like yours where it was supposed to be so close knit, but really people are seeking connection. They're not actually really authentically getting it. Like they're not getting it for real.
Mhm.
And it's not, there isn't a depth to it. There isn't a genuineness to it. And that's heartbreaking to hold up against what you said you were seeking from day one, which was connection and community. And
Yeah.
so ultimately it didn't even provide that.
And there's nothing so lonely as being in a crowd, right?
Oh gosh, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, you're in a crowd, but you feel like completely isolated, alone, unseen, unknown, even if everybody's talking to you. I had my life of the party days, and yeah, still, but it was all kind of a charade
Hmm.
because it's talking to everybody, but I felt completely unseen and unknown.
Yep.
Mhm.
And being on the worship team, being very visible at the front of the church and such, everyone knew me,
Mhm.
but no one actually knew me. And
Yeah.
the people who supposedly were there to mentor me and such ended up causing more harm than good, because they didn't. I mean, they weren't in a healthy place themselves because of
Mhm.
what the church was teaching.
Mhm. How about people who were not a part of this church group? I know you already mentioned how you were taught to respond to family members who are not a part of it, which is not a correct representation of the division Jesus talks about that can come between family members. That's not what's being talked about there. That's very different. That's not us excommunicating people because they go to the church down the street instead of the church we go to. There is division that's going to naturally happen by following Christ. Division can happen. So if I'm a Christian, I'm following Christ, and I have a parent who does not and hates that I'm Christian and thinks that I'm dumb for being Christian, there's going to be division that happens because I'm going to make my decisions in accordance with my belief in Christ anyway. And we're going to have disagreement, and relationships can lose depth, and sometimes they're lost completely. So division can happen by being a Christian when everyone in our family is not also a Christian. This is not something where I have to go create and just hack people off. Now, there may be times where I do need to cut communication as a boundary for different reasons. So that can get, again, more nuanced there as well. But I just want to reflect back there. Now, with that in relation to family, did that then flow into how you were told to interact or how you were told to view anyone, related or not, who was not a part of that congregation?
The division that was within the church, where there wasn't any real connection. You had surface relationships with people, and you all try to make yourself seem more, in line, than they were, at least.
Mm.
That expanded to the rest of the your relationships. And at the time, I was going to college, pursuing my undergraduate. And so I had to be around other people. I had to be in classes and doing study groups and projects and such. So I feel that that was protective for
Mhm.
me, even though at the same time, there's very much a I don't want to use the word spirit, but an attitude at this particular university that anything of God is obviously foolish.
Mhm.
And so it was. my faith was being attacked on multiple fronts,
Mm.
but I didn't have connection with other people in the community. I didn't have close friends, especially since I was new. I'd only been here for a couple of years by that point, and I didn't have anyone to turn to.
Mm.
Which if I had been here longer and had had deeper relationships, I don't know if I would have turned to them because of the teachings of that church and the exclusivity that was being explicitly taught. I
Mhm.
internally, I didn't agree with it, but looking back on my behavior at that time, withdrawal and such, even though I told myself that I don't buy into this attitude, it still affected how I acted.
Mhm.
And that is the pernicious aspect of false teachings, is that even if you try to take that thought captive, to paraphrase Paul, you end up being influenced by it to some degree or another.
Mm. I can definitely see how that proved true. And I can see how it's proved true for, oh my goodness, so many of us who have had similar experiences. And I very much appreciate your point that even if you had had strong external relationships, it's unlikely that you would have turned to them because of that indoctrination of who they were and how to really not value what they had to say. And it's a tough place, those of us who love someone who is in a group where those are the kinds of beliefs that are being taught and practiced. It puts us in a tough spot because we can feel like no matter what we say, it's not going to weigh anything. Like it's not going to carry any weight in the conversation. And so when Be Emboldened comes alongside someone who is in that position, we talk about how do we show love well, how do we engage in all ways possible and not just focus on our fear for them and what we're going to ultimately what we want to say, because it can just shut them down and then they don't communicate it with us at all. And so how do we really love well and try to keep the door open for relationship while still having integrity? And it can be a tough line to walk. It absolutely can be done though. So I understand what you're saying. I had many people, and also we can just hide stuff and when we're the people in it. So I would filter so much out. I mean, people, I had friends outside of the group, but they had no idea what was going on inside the group because I just didn't share that information because I knew that they wouldn't receive it well. So I just hid it.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons anyway. I had other things going on, other factors, but that would be one of them.
Yep. And there comes a point where you doubt whether anyone will believe you because you don't
Mm.
even know if you believe it yourself. Uh,
Right.
this can't be happening.
Mhm.
Why would this be happening to me? This happens to other people. This happens in other
Mhm.
communities, and it's like human trafficking. It happens in every community, and
Mhm.
we have to have the courage, if you will, to see it for what it is
Mhm.
and to take steps toward true healing and true relationship. Um, and that's very hard.
Mhm. It is very hard. And yet it's accurate. It's a more accurate way of living. So to be able to see what's really going on and what's true and what the truth is. And so, but I don't say that lightly because yeah, anytime we come to realize something, we see a spot that was a blind spot and now isn't. Again, it comes that comes at cost. Now, there's also I think a lot of benefit there. There's a lot of reward to be had as well, but also does come at cost. And so grief is always a part of this conversation.
It's true.
And Josh, so you mentioned earlier sort of the catalyst that brought this to a close. That it was sort of this, it sounds like just a lot of things happened. And ultimately you stepped away. But I'm curious, well, first, how did that go for you? But maybe some clarity on, did the church actually disintegrate and so it was all done, or did you actually step away from it and it was ongoing?
So the church still exists,
Okay.
but since that time, there was an interim pastor, and then now a new pastor, and by all accounts, it has once again become a healthy church. I myself have not attended that church since I left, and
Mhm.
I've run into various members that never did leave,
Mhm.
and I find it difficult to engage with them, because there's this certain level of suspicion within myself,
Mhm.
because I just don't know what happened in some of that time, and I don't know if they're safe people to talk to.
Mhm.
Don't have anything against them, and I pray for. Well, I find myself praying for like everyone all the time. Literally, strangers. I hear something on the radio and I pray for someone. But I've seen those people that I had some interactions with shortly after I left, and who were accusing me of some really awful things. I've seen transitions in their lives, where the the hardness, or the the callousness that I perceived, at least when I left, isn't there anymore. And I would like to believe that the church is now very healthy, and that they're doing really good things. And I hear good accounts. I just can't bring myself to go back to that church,
Mhm.
um,
Sure.
even as a visitor.
Mhm. That's fair. And fortunately, can't see any reason from what you've said why it would be necessary for you to take that on.
Mhm.
And sometimes it does come down to that. Is it necessary? Do I need to? Okay, no, there's a different building I can walk into.
Yeah, yeah, and currently I've been part of a different church in the community for, well, there was a couple months where I didn't have a church, because I really didn't know what I was um, getting into. I didn't know what would be safe, what wouldn't be safe, where to go. There was concerns about being stalked. There's a lot of issues going on at that point. But once I started going to my current church, first time I went there, and I was invited there by someone that I trusted very deeply. Um, Once my first time going there, I actually left because I was so overwhelmed and I didn't feel safe.
Mm,
And it took several months of just kind of attending, and then being in the back, and then talking to one or two people and such, to start integrating back into that. And all the while, I found myself being very critical of of any teaching that I was hearing, and making sure that they didn't say anything that was out of line with scripture, because I was very much ready to leave. It's like, I'm not going to be part of something that is going to mess me up like I just got messed up. I can't do that
mm,
again. And thankfully, now, some goodness, I think it's been 8 years or so now, I feel very at home in my
mm,
church. And I don't agree with everything 100%, but I can tell you that there's no intentional misleadings. And if you challenge leadership on something, especially theologically, they are willing to listen. And that's essential, because previously, you it was understood, that you don't challenge leadership. You don't question what they're teaching
mm,
you. They are the shepherds, you're the sheep, that sort of thing. They are the ones with the crooked staff.
mm,
And I think a healthy dynamic is where there is room for a bit of that pushback. obviously in a respectful, relational way, but um, there has to be room for checks and balances.
Mhm.
Where there's too much opportunity for abuse and unhealth.
Absolutely. Yeah, and something that's important to even look for is a leader who desires that accountability. Someone who's like, "No, I want limited power. I want these checks and balances. I want an elder board, for example, and I want them not to be all my relatives and my BFFs because I want them to actually do what they're there to do. And I want to have that set up." So, yes, absolutely. And even if the person, gosh, we see this sometimes, right? Where it starts out well and then it goes haywire.
Hmm.
So having that in place to be like, I prayerfully, it doesn't go haywire, but what if it does? We want to make sure that there would be someone there to stop it before people are getting hurt.
Exactly.
And so I look for a leader who values that.
Yeah. And I mean, to use a cooking story, the way to cook a frog is not to throw the frog into boiling water because it'll just jump right out. And if you go to a church that's, very obviously unhealthy and you visit, you're not going to go back.
Right.
But the way to cook a frog is you put them in normal water and
Mhm.
you slowly heat it up till they realize it's too late. And that's kind of what happened to me is that there wasn't anything too off when I first started going that I just left. It wasn't until a lot of damage had already been done.
Mhm.
And so it's kind of how I think about it. So you need to wonder, what is this water actually like? What is the purpose of this
Mhm.
environment? Is it meant to edify and to help people get better? Or is it, a pressure cooker of sorts in order to make people into something, more palatable for leadership or, you know, less effective as part of the actual church?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and something I remember Mary Jo Sharp said in the episode we released, I think it was February 2nd, if I'm not mistaken. She talked about looking for transformation within that church body. Like, we should, and now it's hard to necessarily walk in and be like, "Well, I'm new here. I don't know if anyone's
Right.
changed because I don't know how they were." But as you get to know people and you have conversations, and even as you're there, if you're there for over a period of time, like, are we seeing that people are growing? There's sanctification is happening, and we want to see that. And I love our frog thing that we have going on. But I also, for anyone who's not watching on YouTube, you're not going to be able to see my hands, but kind of use this very simple, basic visual with people of, when we're asked, well, how on earth does this happen? Like Josh or Naomi, how does this happen? How do you wind up in a situation where it's so obviously bad? Well, it's so obviously bad at the end, like you said. But when you come in, it's like we don't go from here to here. Like we don't just hop on over. It creeps along. And then by the time we get here, this isn't that big of a deal, especially comparatively to backing all the way back out to here.
Hmm.
And so it's like, okay, I'm more committed. I've got time in. I've got, gosh, I put a lot of eggs in this basket. And so it's a lot easier to stay here or to make a final hop, depending on what that may look like in someone's story. And also when we back out, it's like this. It's not just, "Whoo, I'm back over here, I'm good to go." It's like, no, maybe I put a lot of space in between, but internally, I've got a lot of unpacking to do.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of healing and then rebuilding to do.
Yeah. And when I left that church, I was still incredibly vulnerable. It's only by the grace of God that
Mhm.
He put me where I am in terms of this church and a true Christian community. But for the you know next couple of years after I left that unhealthy church, um, I didn't have someone to work through things with. I didn't have a mentor. I didn't have
Mhm.
that sort of guidance. I couldn't talk through what was going on with anyone because I still had the residuals of being new to the area and having been isolated with that church. And so it took a long time
Mhm.
to really heal and work through things.
Mhm.
And that's where I'm grateful to have had, professional counseling,
Mhm.
um, even though that was awfully late in the game, at a point where I was deeply suicidal and such, which I can trace back to not just that church, but all the circumstances surrounding it and
Mhm.
the fallout. So I guess if I'm trying to make a point with that, you were saying with that analogy, you can't expect to move back and be okay, even if that distance is there.
Mhm.
Because even if that distance is there, like it was with me, internally I was messed up, and I
Mhm.
didn't have someone to turn to. I didn't have
Right.
that guidance that I really, really needed.
Yeah.
So
And so often we don't because we were taught to have everything be within, like everything's in house. And so if you leave the house, there's no one. And then how do we even trust? And it just, yeah. So hence being emboldened exists, right? 'Cause gosh, I mean, I didn't have anywhere to go either. And so fine, we tend to create things for gaps and lacks that we've experienced in our own lives. And so I'm thankful to be able to start to offer something that can fill that gap for people. May be a good fit, it may not be, but I'm glad to that we're able to come together and Josh have you on the team to offer something to fill it, offer services and resources. So I'm curious if you have found anything of benefit from this experience as you've had more space between then and now.
I'm actually incredibly grateful. I mentioned earlier how I had prayed that God put me in a church where I needed to be, and looking back on it, that's exactly what happened. Because the stuff going on with my family, that actually helped provide some healing,
Mm,
um, indirectly.
mm,
And that's how God often works. Is He doesn't take a direct path, a straight shot from here to healed. It's circuitous, and sometimes there's hills and valleys and very dangerous trials. And I don't mean dangerous necessarily in a literal sense, but my experience at that church, it helped me to deepen my own faith, to go straight to the source rather than just to listen and take things more passively.
mm,
And so, as such, I've become more studious, a better student, if you will, of the Bible itself, of biblical context. Because that's one of the ways that Scripture is often misused. Is you take a single verse that was meant for a very specific audience, speaking to a very specific circumstance or
mm,
situation, and you twist it and you apply it to something that wasn't at all meant to be. And so, in learning, having been through that and learning more about biblical history and the culture of the time, even Roman history and such, I understand more easily if something's being taken out of context.
mm,
And so I can guard my own heart, my own mind, and I can, you know, discern whether or not it's accurate.
mm,
So it's been, in that case, it's been tremendous, of tremendous benefit.
mm. Yeah, so important. Game changer. How has this history shaped you as a father, as a friend, husband? How's it changed you?
Well, I don't want to give up on relationships as easy. That's for sure.
Mhm,
Um, I am more willing to listen and to try to understand someone's heart rather than the words that they say. Um, and that ties into, um, the educational realm and therapy and such too. But to realize that people's words are only one facet of who they are, and you have to examine all of it. That continuity, like we mentioned at the beginning, the continuity of behavior and actions and claims, and if it's consistent across the board. And so when I'm parenting, I'm more aware of my own inconsistencies or areas where I'll have a knee jerk reaction, and I'll hear someone else come out of my mouth, and I'm like, whoa, take that back.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that.
Mhm.
Um, and it's allowed me to become more humble, instead of thinking that I got this and I don't have to have guidance or oversight. So yeah, the whole experience, as awful as it was, I'm grateful for it,
Mhm.
because through it and through the mentoring and the healing and the relationships that I've been able to develop since then, especially within the past 3 or so years, it's been transformative. And I mentioned that I was deeply suicidal and such, previously. Not the case anymore. Not at
Mhm.
all anymore. And that is only by the grace of God and
Mhm.
true healing.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. The way I usually say it is with what's come out of the experience, and I don't even know ultimately what that is yet because I'm still living, but just as of today, I would really prefer not to do it again, but I wouldn't give back what's come from it either.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. As in the good that has been brought out of it outweighs the bad that I'm still carrying
exactly.
or the hard that I'm still carrying. Yeah. And the hard is still real, but it doesn't outweigh in the opposite direction. So,
Yeah. And to speak to that, heart is still real. There are days when I still have those questions pop up, or I still hear an echo, and the the hard thing to do is to not just like try to throw it away, because pain and trauma and grief and such, they can be friends, true friends. They may come in unannounced, uninvited. They stay longer than you want them to,
mm,
but in the end, they teach you things that no other friend can.
mm,
And those are the lessons that are the hardest to learn, the most painful, but ultimately provide the best benefit for us in our faith and in our relationships with others.
mm, absolutely. If you were to issue your loved ones or your children a warning in hopes of them never finding themselves in a similar situation, what red flag would you want them to be aware of?
Mm. I would say probably the single largest red flag would be, a sense of isolation. If any sort of group, whether it's a church or a family or an after school club, whatever it is, if they start acting or teaching that their group is the only thing that matters, and
Mm,
that anything outside the group is either dangerous or evil or wrong or whatever it is, then that's a huge red flag. And seek help.
mhm,
Seek those outside, because Proverbs tells us in the multitude of counselors there's safety.
mhm,
It uses the word safety, not guidance or anything. It's safety.
mhm,
Don't live in an echo chamber, because it's very dangerous in there.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Agreed. And I think too, when you were talking about how you felt isolated, if you're feeling isolated, now that could be something going on with you, It could also be a dynamic going on in the group that is nonverbal. So again, we receive messaging all the time, all day long, especially in 2023 United States culture anyway. So we're constantly getting bombarded. So we're taking in nonverbal cues. We're taking in things that people aren't speaking. We're picking up on these cues. And so there could be something that you're tuning into that maybe hasn't been spoken, or there may be a need that you're having that isn't being met and that needs to be. So again, it's a point to pause, to be like, okay, I'm going to press pause here
Mhm.
and I'm going to reassess what's going on. Why is this the case? Maybe there's some steps I need to take. Maybe there's some steps others need to take. Let me pause and investigate. So even that feeling of isolation can be, I know when I feel that, when I start to, because I have my sad days. And so I'll have these days where I'm like, whew, and there's times where I'm like, I want to step back and isolate for a bit. And I am retreating into the Lord when I do that. For me, I'm like, that's where I'm at in my relationship with God. It's like, Lord, I need to just retreat back into you, because apparently I have not been holding your hand as much as I've needed to day lately. And so I need a longer day of quality time today with you. And then I'm able to step forward again. That's different than when I'm in a room with people and I'm like, gosh, I feel so isolated. I feel so alone. Why is that? Am I unwilling to be vulnerable today? And maybe there's good reason, maybe there's not. Do I need to step out and make an effort? Or is there something going on and maybe this isn't a great environment for me to stay in? So again, there can be different reasons for things, but unless we press pause long enough to think about it and to ask ourselves those questions, maybe like you said, speak to others and get what they have to say about the situation, we just keep going. Lives are full, lives get busy, and we just keep going along. It's like, hold on, slow down long enough to let those thoughts surface so that we can act on them if we need to. Josh, to close us out today, how does this experience influence you as a mentor for Be Emboldened?
Well, I believe that people who have experienced trauma are the best equipped, even if they have to get counseling on their own and work through stuff on their own and such. They're the best equipped to help others who either are experiencing trauma currently or recently or even in the past have experienced trauma, because there's a connection there. You can see it, you can feel it, you understand what it's like, and it may not look the same for someone else as it did for you. Because there are people who had very, very different experiences than I had. But there's that connection that we face, where we were misled somehow. We were taken advantage somehow, mistreated or otherwise, even put on a pedestal and been someone who's led others astray because we were told that's what we needed to do. And so to take that experience, to take that trauma and to use it to truly connect with someone else who may not be as far out of it as I am. It's incredibly rewarding and incredibly real, because I'm not so disconnected from it, as I might be if I just read a couple of books about spiritual abuse and decided, hey, this is a good field. I want to help people. You know,
Hmm. There's a different kind of knowing that comes with the experience. And
yeah,
thank you for choosing to let that knowing be a part of your walk forward in
yeah.
serving others.
And I suppose the last thing that I would have to say, um, is to anyone who thinks that they might be experiencing spiritual abuse, um, is to learn yourself, to do what it says in Second Timothy 2:15, to study and rightfully divide the word of truth yourself, to understand what is God actually trying to say here? What's the culture? What's the context? all those different things. You don't have to become a theological scholar, don't have to get a PhD or a doctorate or anything in that. But if someone says something that has any sort of spiritual implication, then be like the Bereans who heard what Paul was saying and still challenged it and held up his doctrine to the truth of Scripture and found it to be valid. And if it's not valid, if it's not, something that God Himself would have said, throw it out. And I tell people that about my own stuff. I tell my kids that is like, if I say something that you can point to Scripture and say, hey, that's not right, then first of all, tell me about it because I don't want to perpetuate that. But second, throw it out because it doesn't hold water.